Hey everyone, and welcome to my session for this year's Azure Spring Clean. And this is, as usual, our yearly event that's organised by MVPs Joe Carlisle and Thomas Thornton. And thanks again to the guys for allowing me to participate this year. Let's go back in time to 1975 when Paul Simon was singing that there must be 50 ways to leave your lover. Nearly 50 years ago now, and it's one of those iconic songs that comes on the radio, you find yourself humming it for hours afterwards. Now, not for a minute am I suggesting that you should do such a thing, and if you're listening, dear, hello, I'm not planning anything, don't worry. But recently, when it was on one of its radio airplays and I was humming along to it afterwards, it got me thinking. There must be 50 ways to secure your Azure. Now, don't worry, I'm not releasing a song. I wouldn't wish that on anyone. It would only hurt your ears, but let's turn this into a session and let's see if there is 50 ways to secure your Azure. I'm not sure if Paul ever gave us 50 ways to leave your lover, but let's see if we can give this a try. Brief intro to me and the session. I am Michael Durkin. I am a Microsoft Azure MVP. I work for Avanade as an Azure Cloud Solutions Architect. I'm a LinkedIn Learning instructor. I hold multiple Azure certifications. I'm a speaker and content creator. So let's jump into the session and let's look at our intro to cloud security first of all. And let's look at the importance of cloud security, because more and more organizations are adopting that cloud-first approach to enable them to modernize their services and transform their operations with agility at scale. However, security and compliance risk remains the greatest barrier to cloud adoption. And if we combine that with the difficulties in proactively addressing the complexity of secure configuration and a shortage of skills, these challenges can be major roadblocks to a cloud-first journey. So what do we need to do? As for starters, we need to look at the best practices. And the best practices would be to deploy and design base security controls to create a secure landing zone on which the cloud solution will sit. We're going to use integrated security controls in each of the cloud services we use so that they're reusable. So whether we're using IaaS, PaaS or SaaS, we're going to integrate those controls with the wider picture that we're trying to make. And we're going to combine those platform and services to bring together existing client security tools and integrate those with the business's operational processes and procedures. So the actions we need to take out of this: we need to spell out the roles that are authorized to operate in the environment and what they're allowed to do. We need to secure the connectivity to on-premise data centers and use a hub and spoke network security model. And we need to secure landing zone configuration policies and apply cloud service provider platform security controls. Let's take a look now at the common threats in cloud environments. So let's kick off with misconfiguration. And that's one of the leading causes of cloud data breaches. So cloud infrastructure is designed to be easily usable and to enable easy data sharing, but because of its complexity, it's easy for a misconfiguration or security oversight to leave an organization's cloud-based resources exposed to attackers. Unauthorized access. So unlike an organization's on-premises infrastructure, their cloud-based deployments are outside the network perimeter and directly accessible from the public internet. So while this is convenient for accessibility of the environment to both employees and customers, it also makes it easier for an attacker to gain unauthorized access to an organization's cloud-based resources, which can happen at times without an organization's knowledge. Unsecured interfaces or APIs, they're normally provided to their customers, and they're normally well documented in an attempt to make them easily usable for the CSP's customers. However, if they're not secured correctly, these can be used by a cyber criminal to identify and exploit potential methods for accessing and exfiltrating sensitive data from an organization's cloud environment. Hijacking of accounts. Many people have extreme weak password security, including password reuse and the use of weak passwords. And this problem exacerbates the impact of phishing attacks and data breaches, since it enables a single stolen password to be used on multiple different accounts. And an attacker with an employee's credentials can access sensitive data or functionality, and compromised customer credentials give full control over their online account. Visibility. Traditional monitoring platforms and tools that were used for on-premises visibility are not effective for cloud environments. This can limit an organization's ability to monitor their cloud-based resources and protect them against attack. External data sharing. The cloud and most cloud environments are designed to make data sharing easy. We've all done it. We've all clicked on a link in OneDrive, hit share, and many clouds provide this option to explicitly invite both internal and external users via email, or to share a link that enables anyone with the URL to access the shared resource. And while it's convenient for collaboration, it can also be a major cloud security issue. We've all heard of malicious insiders, and they're becoming a major security issue for any organization. A malicious insider already has authorized access to the organization's network and some of the sensitive resources that it contains, and any attempts to gain this level of access are what reveals most attackers to their target, making it hard for an unprepared organization to detect a malicious insider. And not just that, we've all seen malicious insiders who have left companies, been removed forcibly, and have taken company information with them to sell to competitors or indeed to cyber criminals. When it comes to cyber attacks, cloud-based infrastructure is directly accessible from the public internet, and it's often improperly secured and contains a great deal of sensitive and valuable data. And additionally, the cloud is used by many different companies, meaning that a successful attack can likely be repeated many times with a high probability of success. And as a result, cloud deployments for organizations are a common target of these attacks. And finally, denial of service attacks. The cloud is essential to many organizations' ability to do business. They use the cloud to store business-critical data and to run important internal and customer-facing applications. And a successful denial of service attack against cloud infrastructure will have a major impact on a number of different companies. And in some cases, the attackers may demand a ransom in order to stop the attack. Let's take a look at the Azure security overview. We can see on our diagram at the top here, this is our baseline Azure security architecture and how it all ties together in the security world. So as you can see, we've got our access management, threat protection, cloud security, information protection, discover and respond, compliance management, insider risk, and information governance. We also need to be aware of the shared responsibility model. And for all cloud deployment types, you own your data and identities, whether it's software as a service, platform as a service, infrastructure as a service, even back to on-prem. You're responsible for protecting the security of your data and identities, your on-premises resources, and the cloud components you control. So regardless of the deployment, you always retain the following responsibilities, which are data, endpoints, account, and access management. And on that, let's jump into identity and access management. So from Microsoft's perspective, Azure Active Directory was obviously renamed last year to Entra ID. With Entra ID, you get things like privileged identity management backed by role-based access control. We also get multi-factor authentication, and what that can do for us is that allows us to secure our identities to ensure that the people who are actually making the authentication or authorization request are the ones who are actually doing it, and they're getting notifications on mobile phones via authenticator apps. And as you can see from the table here, there's a number of different versions of Entra ID. We've got security defaults, which contains a baseline level of security. We have our free one also then for global admins only, which has slightly more in it. Office 365, obviously they'll use Entra ID, and that'll bring in MFA for trusted devices. But then once you move into the premium SKUs, they're the recommended ones. They're the ones that you need to use and should be using. From a network security perspective, all of these, or the majority of services that you're going to use in the cloud, are going to be network integrated, so need to have that level of network security. If you're putting in a virtual network, you're going to break that up into subnets, and the recommendation is that you would have network security groups protecting each subnet, because normally each subnet would be protecting a particular service, such as Cosmos, API management, storage accounts, etc. They'd be separated off into their own subnets. They can also then have route tables or user-defined routes assigned, so that all routing for all traffic goes back to an Azure firewall to be inspected and ensure that the next hop is the correct next hop. But it also inspects the data for any malicious content and ensures that the data is routed to where it needs to go. On top of that, then you can put in virtual network service endpoints and private links, so that particular services, so I'm thinking about things like API management or app service with a backend into Cosmos, that they have those private links in place to make sure that they're only accessible between those services. If we jump up into data security, with data security, we have the option of the Azure Storage Encryption Service, where we can use either customer or Microsoft managed keys to manage your storage encryption. We also have database encryption features, which are a part of the Azure SQL managed service and Azure SQL database services. And finally, everything we can manage from a key management and a security, from a secrets, certificates and keys perspective, we can manage with key management with Azure Key Vault. Jumping forward into application security, and for application security we can deploy Azure Application Gateway with a web application firewall. And what this will also do for us, it will give us the OWASP core rule set, which is there to protect against any application level bugs such as SQL injection attacks, things like that. Also just recently released, at the time of the recording, you now have Azure Application Gateway for containers, which enhances that. It gives you now a full container service for Azure container instances. We can go for secure deployments with Azure DevOps and GitHub, so we can integrate with managed identities to ensure that only the correct code is being deployed. And it's also a good idea then, if you're using this, to have multiple subscriptions, to have your dev, test and production subscriptions and follow that environment management configuration. We can also do drift detection as part of DevOps and GitHub, so it will tell us, let's say for example, if we're using Terraform, it can tell us then if there has been a drift detected in the state file compared to what is going to be deployed and what the current state of the infra is. And finally, we mentioned container security there with App Gateway. We can also do container security obviously with Azure Kubernetes Service, which is a much bigger platform. From a monitoring and detection perspective, well, here we've got Azure Security Center, we've got Azure Advisor recommendations, which are available on each of our services. We have Azure Monitor and Log Analytics, so all of our logs from all of our services are sent to Log Analytics and can be displayed in Azure Monitor using things like Azure Monitor workbooks, or if we want to go for something like Managed Grafana, expensive product, but it's a very good product. And the other thing then, of course, is Sentinel. And we can use Sentinel for our event management and also as a SOC service as well. From a threat response and detection perspective, we mentioned denial of service attacks in the common security threats, and Azure DDoS protection can be deployed either at network level or at tenant level to give us that full protection against those denial of service attacks. We can use Azure Advanced Threat Protection, which will integrate with Defender for Cloud and also Sentinel and Azure Monitor to give us kind of a full advanced threat landscape and holistic view of any threats that are coming into our organization. And we can also go for an instant response linked to Azure security benchmarks, and they'd be things like CIS benchmarks, NIST benchmarks, PCI DSS, and we can enforce these with Azure policy then if required. Let's just jump quickly into security best practices. We talked in the identity slide about principle of least privilege. And principle of least privilege is important because it ensures that we're only allowed to do what we should need to do. An Entra ID can handle this from both an administrative perspective, where you're looking for access to Azure resource services in order to manage the tenant and the underlying components, and also for users who might need access to the actual portal applications or data that you have stored in your cloud environment. Coupled in with that then would be something like regular security audits and compliance checks. So for example, with privileged identity management, you would have regular access reviews that can be done to ensure that that environment is protected. And also there's compliance checks again that can be done in conjunction with Azure policy defined against baselines, which we talked about in the previous slide. It's also very important to have data backup and recovery strategies. You never know when you're going to need a backup. That may be the case of an attack or a misconfiguration, or you may just want to roll back to a previous version of your infra application. Obviously for some services such as app service, web apps, portal apps, you can deploy things like staging slots, which can have an immediate rollback. But for things like storage accounts, data, virtual machines, etc., it's better to use things like Azure Backup, which has that built-in IaaS capability, which will enable you to roll back. When we look at the Azure tools and, Azure security tools and integrations, obviously Defender for Cloud is the one that sticks out. You can have, there are multiple iterations of Defender for Cloud. You've got Defender for servers, Defender for APIs, Defender for storage. That's just to name but a few. Defender for containers, Defender for Kubernetes. There's loads there that's available to you in that entire Defender suite, and that's really a key thing. You can then tie that in with Azure Sentinel, which those two can be linked. You can also link it with your log analytics workspaces to check for any threats that are coming in, and also have runbooks that are available there to fully have your environment fully available, fully visible, and have that visibility as to what's happening, and have the ability to respond to any impending threats that may be happening. We've also got Azure Information Protection, which is the underlying compliance tool that can be used to put compliance locks or compliance holds on your data to ensure that if anything gets deleted, go back to our malicious insiders there, the compliance hold is there, it's in place, and it's also an auditing and tracking tool as well. You can also put in third-party integrations. There's obviously a lot of talk about multi-cloud at the minute, and things like Azure Arc can have integrations into both AWS and GCP. Dare we mention their name. And there's also other third-party integrations that you can have as well with third-party provider tools. And I'm talking about things here like QRadar, Qualys, Fortinet, etc. All of those sort of vendors. Okay, we've had a look at an awful lot of slides here. I'm just going to throw this one up on the screen. So this is a kind of a sample application and sample subscription with those different resource groups. So if we can kind of see here, if we look at we've got our app gateway on the edge, and that's where our user is coming in. That's been protected with our WAF policy. That will then have access into whatever the application is presented via API management. So as you can see, we've got everything split up. We've got a virtual network. We've got all of our different services split up into subnets. We've then got our NSGs protecting all of those subnets, and we've also got our user-defined route that's going back to the Azure firewall to see where the traffic needs to go next, and also to be inspected if it needs to go out onto the internet. As you can see as well from our corporate office, some things we haven't mentioned there. We've got both site-to-site VPN and express route coming into a virtual network gateway. That's important as well, just to have that there as an extra security measure. You can have one or the other, or both. You can have express route backed by a site-to-site VPN, and that's important then when we talk about user-defined routes to get your routing in place as well. If we look up then up at the top, you can see we've got Log Analytics, Azure Monitor Sentinel, and also Application Insights, which will be built into any application that is deployed. And that gives you a kind of a deep, in-depth, step-by-step log of everything that's happening in the environment. And then over in our management group, we've got our DNS zones hosted in Azure, and we've also got our Azure DevOps with our self-hosted private build agents in a virtual machine scale set. We've got our storage, and then we've got our dedicated key vault for those as well. And up at the top, wrapping all around that, we've got various types of Azure services there. So we mentioned Defender for Cloud and how extensive that is. We also mentioned DDoS protection, which again can be deployed at either network or tenant level. Entra ID. We've also got Azure AD B2C. So Azure AD B2B and B2C have not yet been renamed to Entra anything. I'm not really sure why, but it hasn't. And that can be useful if you've got external participants or external consumers who are coming in and using your service. From a capacity and cost perspective, you've got Azure load testing up there at the top, which can help define what sort of limits are on your application. And that can also help you with your cost management, which is obviously the next one we see there. And the last two, Microsoft 365. I've spoken about this before. I think Office 365, back as far as BPOS, that was people's first introduction to the cloud, and it still is. A lot of companies are still there and they're still using Microsoft 365 with Entra ID identities, in some cases in a cloud only, but the majority of them are using synchronized identities from on-premise Active Directory there as well. And finally there we've got Azure Virtual Desktop. So I talked about Azure AD B2C for external people a second ago. You can also securely give external users, and particularly those users who may be working remotely, Azure Virtual Desktop, either via a remote desktop or a remote app, will give them secure access. It'll bring them into the network, and again, you can have, could be illustrated here, you could have an Azure Virtual Desktop resource group that has dedicated routing, dedicated network access, and it'll also have the access built into these NSGs down here in our application environment. So that just gives you a flavor of that full end-to-end idea of how that layered security approach, that well-managed tenant. We talked about hub and spoke. There's our hub over there with our app gateway, our firewall, and our virtual network gateway. There's no compute running there, neither should there ever be. And of course, you can also integrate App Gateway and Firewall together. You can integrate App Gateway with things like Azure Front Door, Azure Content Delivery Network, Azure Traffic Manager, etc. if you're using high availability scenarios as well. So, and then you've got all of your spokes out here with your application management and security, and you wrap that around with all of the services above. So that just gives you an idea of a well-managed, well-architected tenant. Staying up to date with Azure security. Okay, well, the security landscape is a constantly moving one. Okay, and certifications are normally the thing that we would use to stay up to date. And obviously there's a range of those that talk about Azure security. You've obviously got the old reliable AZ500, the Azure security certification. We've also had the flip in the last number of years to the SC series of certifications, and as always they'll start with a 900 with security fundamentals. The SC200 is focused very much on Defender, Sentinel, SOC and SIEM. The SC300 focuses on identity and access, and SC400 focuses on compliance and information protection. And from memory, I think you need to pass one of those before you qualify for the big one, which is the SC100, which is the security equivalent of the AZ305, and that one is the Cybersecurity Architect Expert exam. It's not just about certifications though, it's about staying up to date with blogs, newsletters, community forums. Head over to Tech Community, the Azure security blog is there, giving, you know, weekly or sometimes more than that articles on all of the things that I've mentioned so far in this video. People to follow. Rod Trent at Microsoft, always a good guy to follow. Charlie Goff, good friend of mine, and we're into security MVPs now at this stage. So we've got Charlie, Dean Ellerby, Dwayne Natwick, Matthew Brown, and Rue Campbell, and they all talk about various different things in their fields. They're the guys that I would recommend you go follow. If you want to go follow anyone, go to them, find them, read their blogs, reach out to them on LinkedIn. We're all MVPs. We're all available to people. We're all available to, talk to people, answer questions, get on a call. Come talk to us if you need us. In conclusion, if we're looking at well-managed, well-architected, layered, defense-in-depth security, that's really where we want to be. We don't want to just have like the good old days where you put something into an on-premises environment and you stick a firewall in and you think a firewall is going to do everything for you. As we've seen, the way the cloud security landscape has changed, the way that posture has changed, it's not really that simple anymore. And definitely that's the sort of layering and defense in depth that I've talked about here, coupled with Microsoft's well-managed and well-architected framework. That's certainly going to help you when you're standing up your cloud organization's environment, and it's going to make your cloud security journey an awful lot easier. As well as that, regular audits, regular access reviews, keep an eye, okay? We talked about the access reviews as part of PIM, but as well as that, keep auditing, keep looking, keep it well managed, keep it managed regularly, and make sure, whatever you do, make sure that the information you're collecting is relevant, because we've all seen it before with monitoring solutions. You might look at them, you suddenly get a flood of emails or a flood of alerts and you tend to ignore them. So fine tune your monitoring, fine tune your alerting, make sure it all works. And with tools like Defender for Cloud, Sentinel, Azure Advanced Threat Protection, you'll be able to do that. That's it. Thanks very much for watching my session. That was 50 ways to secure your Azure, or was it? I'm not really sure. I haven't counted. Feel free to go back and count if you want. But then again, I'm not sure that back in 1975, Paul really did give us 50 ways to leave your lover. Not when he was talking about getting on a bus, Gus, and making a new plan, Stan. You see, I'm going to have you humming this now. All feedback is welcome. And I do love getting feedback. You can reach out to me on any of my social channels. You'll get me on my blog, on Twitter, LinkedIn, Blue Sky, Mastodon, and I've just started up a YouTube channel, which is hopefully where you're watching this, and there's loads more content of that to come. And speaking of more content to come, keep an eye out, stay tuned over the coming week for loads more amazing content from a lot of awesome people as part of this year's Azure Spring Clean. Thanks very much for watching, and I will catch you on the next one.